The sterile walls of St. Jude's Hospital had seen thousands of faces, but none were as overlooked as Audrey Hart. To the arrogant chief surgeon, Dr. Sterling, she was just the maid in scrubs, a clumsy older hire, good for nothing but changing bedpans and taking insults. He laughed at her silence. He mocked her trembling hands. He had no idea that those same hands had once held the lives of Special Forces operators together inside burning Black Hawks over the Hindu Kush. He thought he held all the power until the day the glass doors shattered, not from an explosion, but from the roar of a Navy Seahawk descending right onto his helipad. They weren't looking for a doctor. They were screaming for the nurse he just fired. The rain hammered against the sliding glass doors of the emergency room at St. Jude's Medical Center, a rhythmic drumming that usually soothed Audrey Hart. Tonight, however, it was drowned out by the sharp, stinging voice of Dr. Gregory Sterling. "Hart, for God's sake, are you mopping the floor or painting a masterpiece?" Sterling's voice boomed across the nurse's station, causing two younger residents to snicker behind their clipboards. "We have a trauma incoming in 10 minutes. Try to make the floor less of a death trap, would you?" Audrey didn't look up. She kept her eyes focused on the scuff mark on the linoleum, her grip on the mop handle tightening just enough to turn her knuckles white. "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice soft, devoid of emotion. "Unbelievable," Sterling muttered loud enough for everyone to hear as he turned to Brenda, the head nurse who functioned more as his personal cheerleader than a medical professional. "HR sends me geriatric washouts when I ask for trauma specialists. She's 40 if she's a day, and she moves like she's underwater." Brenda laughed, a shrill sound that grated on Audrey's nerves. "She's just slow, Dr. Sterling. Some people aren't built for the pace of a level 1 trauma center. Maybe she'd be better off in the cafeteria." Audrey squeezed the mop into the yellow bucket. The dirty water swirled dark and murky, much like her memories, though she kept those locked away behind a steel door in her mind. She wasn't slow. She was deliberate. Every movement she made was calculated to conserve energy, a habit ingrained from 72-hour shifts in dust-choked field hospitals where wasted motion meant wasted seconds and wasted seconds meant death. But here in the pristine, fluorescent-lit world of civilian medicine, her economy of motion was mistaken for lethargy. Her silence was mistaken for stupidity. She wheeled the bucket toward the utility closet, passing the trauma bay, where Sterling was preening in front of the residents. He was a tall man, handsome in a superficial way, with a jawline he clearly admired in the mirror every morning. He was a competent surgeon, technically speaking, but his ego took up more space in the room than the gurneys. "Listen up." Sterling was lecturing, gesturing with a scalpel he hadn't used yet. "In trauma, you are gods. You decide who lives, who dies. You don't hesitate. You don't flinch. Unlike some staff members who flinch at the sound of a dropped tray." He cast a derisive glance toward the closet where Audrey was stowing the mop. Earlier, a metal tray had clattered to the floor, and Audrey had instinctively dropped into a low crouch, scanning the perimeter. It was a reflex, a PTSD tick she hadn't managed to kill. To them, she looked like a frightened rabbit. Audrey exited the closet, smoothing her navy blue scrubs. She walked over to the patient chart rack, hoping to find a simple laceration or a fever to tend to something to keep her away from Sterling's orbit. Brenda interjected, stepping in front of the rack. "Dr. Sterling needs his coffee, black 2 sugars, and check bed 4, the drunk guy threw up again. Clean it up." Audrey looked at Brenda. The woman was younger, perhaps 30, with perfectly done makeup that somehow never smeared during a 12-hour shift. "I'm a registered nurse, Brenda, not a janitor. The janitorial staff is on break, but I can call. I'm the charge nurse." Brenda snapped, her smile vanishing. "And I'm telling you to clean bed 4. Unless you want me to write you up for insubordination again, I'm sure the board would love to hear how the new hire is refusing direct orders." Audrey held Brenda's gaze for a second. In that second, a flash of something cold and dangerous flickered in Audrey's eyes, the look of a woman who had once stared down a warlord in a negotiating tent in Kandahar. Brenda blinked, taking a half step back, suddenly unsettled without knowing why. Then the mask slid back into place. Audrey lowered her eyes. "I'll take care of it." "Good," Brenda said, her voice shaking slightly before she regained her composure. "And hurry up. The multi-car pile-up is 5 minutes out." As Audrey walked toward bed 4, she checked her watch. It was an old, battered G-Shock, starkly different from the Apple Watches the other nurses wore. She tapped the face. 5 minutes out. She knew what that meant. She could feel the shift in the air pressure, the static electricity that preceded chaos. She had felt it in Fallujah in Syria, in places that didn't exist on official maps. She pulled the curtain around bed 4. The patient, an elderly homeless man named Silas, whom the staff usually ignored, looked up groggily. "Sorry, darling," he slurred, wiping his mouth. "Sick as a dog." "It's okay, Silas," Audrey said gently, her voice changing instantly from the monotone she used with the staff to a warm, soothing tone. She worked efficiently, cleaning him up, checking his vitals, and adjusting his IV flow rate, which someone had set too high. "You're dehydrated. That's why the nausea is hitting you. I'm slowing the drip. You'll feel better in a moment." "You're a good one," Silas mumbled, his eyes closing. "Better than the loud guy in the white coat. He scares me." "He scares himself, Silas," Audrey whispered, pulling the blanket up to his chin. "Rest now." She stepped out from the curtain just as the red lights above the bay doors began to flash. The ambulance bay doors hissed open, letting in a gust of wind and rain. "Showtime, people!" Sterling shouted, clapping his hands. "Let's see if we can save some lives despite the support staff's incompetence." Audrey stood by the wall, invisible, waiting. She knew the storm wasn't just outside. It was walking through the doors. The ER exploded into controlled chaos. 3 stretchers were wheeled in simultaneously by paramedics who looked drenched and exhausted. "Multi-vehicle collision on I-95, the lead paramedic yelled. "We have a 45-year-old male unrestrained driver, blunt force trauma to the chest. A 20-year-old female passenger, severe lacerations and possible internal bleeding. And a child, years old, unconscious, vitals dropping. I'll take the driver in Bay 1, Sterling barked, rushing forward. "Resnick, you take the girl in Bay 2. Brenda, get the kid to Bay 3 and Page Pediatrics tell them to get down here yesterday." The room became a hive of shouting voices, ripping Velcro, and the shrill alarms of cardiac monitors. Audrey moved to assist Resnick in Bay 2, but Brenda shoved her shoulder. "Not there, Hart. We need gauze and saline in Bay 1. Go be a runner. Don't touch the patients." Audrey didn't argue. She ran to the supply room, grabbed armfuls of saline bags and trauma pads, and sprinted back to Bay 1. Sterling was shouting orders at a terrifying speed. "BP is crashing. He's got a tension pneumothorax. I need a needle 14 gauge now." Audrey handed the needle to a resident who fumbled it in his nervousness. The needle clattered to the floor. "You idiot!" Sterling roared. "Get another one!" The resident froze. The patient on the table was turning blue, his trachea deviating to the left. He had seconds before his heart stopped from the pressure building in his chest. Audrey saw the resident's hands shaking. He couldn't open the packaging of the new needle fast enough. Sterling was busy trying to intubate and couldn't reach over. Without thinking, Audrey stepped in. It was muscle memory. It was instinct, honed by a decade of keeping soldiers alive in the dirt. She didn't grab the needle the resident was struggling with. She reached into her pocket, where she kept her own trauma shears and a spare decompression needle, a habit she couldn't break. In one fluid motion, she stepped up to the patient's right side, palpated the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, and drove the needle in. A sharp hiss of escaping air filled the small silence of the bay. The patient's chest heaved. The color began to return to his face instantly. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed to a steady rhythm. Audrey taped the catheter in place and stepped back, her face blank. Silence. Absolute, stunned silence. The resident stared at her. Brenda stared at her with her mouth open. Slowly, Dr. Sterling looked up from the intubation. He looked at the needle sticking out of the patient's chest. Then he looked at Audrey. His face turned a shade of purple that matched the bruises on the patient. "What did you just do?" Sterling whispered, his voice trembling with rage. "He was crashing, Doctor," Audrey said calmly. The resident was compromised, tension pneumothorax relieved, SATs are rising to 94. "You—" Sterling stepped away from the table, ripping his gloves off. "You are a nurse. You are a geriatric nurse. You do not perform invasive procedures in my ER. You could have killed him. I saved him," Audrey said, her chin lifting slightly. "He would have arrested in 10 seconds. I don't care if you turned water into wine," Sterling screamed, stepping into her personal space. He loomed over her, using his height to intimidate. "You are unlicensed for that procedure in this facility. That is assault. That is malpractice. You are a liability." "Dr. Sterling, the patient is stable," Resnick called out from the next bay, trying to defuse the situation. "Shut up, Resnick." Sterling spun back to Audrey. "Get it. Out." Audrey blinked. "Doctor, get out." Sterling pointed to the automatic doors. "You are fired. Immediately. Get your things and get off my floor before I have security throw you out. I will make sure you never work in a hospital in this state again. You're done." The entire ER was watching. The paramedics, the other nurses, the patients who were conscious. Audrey looked around. She saw pity in some eyes, satisfaction in Brenda's. She felt a familiar weight in her chest, the weight of injustice. But she had swallowed worse things than the ego of a civilian doctor. She unclipped her ID badge. "Fine," she said softly. She placed the badge on the metal tray next to the biohazard bin. "Good luck with the shift." She turned and walked away. The walk of shame. She could feel Sterling's eyes boring into her back. "And don't expect a reference," Sterling shouted after her. Audrey pushed through the doors into the waiting room, the cold air hitting her face. She walked past the confused families, past the security guard, who gave her a nod, and out into the rainy night. She stood under the awning of the hospital entrance, the rain soaking the bottom of her scrub pants. She reached into her pocket for her car keys, her hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She was unemployed. She had rent to pay. She had tried to live a normal life, a quiet life, and she had failed. "Maybe I am broken," she thought. "Maybe I don't belong here." She was about to step into the rain toward the parking lot when a sound made her freeze. It started as a low thrumming, vibrating in the soles of her sneakers. Then it became a rhythmic beating that rattled the windows of the hospital behind her. It grew louder, deeper, a sound she knew better than her own heartbeat. Rotors. But this wasn't the standard medevac chopper that brought trauma patients. The medevac sounded like a lawnmower, high-pitched and whiny. This sound was heavy, aggressive. It was the sound of raw horsepower and military-grade turbine engines. Audrey looked up. Out of the storm clouds cutting through the rain, with searchlights blazing, a massive dark shape descended. It wasn't heading for the helipad on the roof. It was coming down right in the middle of the hospital parking lot, blowing cars' suspension down and sending debris flying. It was a Sikorsky MH-60 Seahawk. Dark grey paint. No medical markings. The wind from the rotors nearly knocked Audrey over. She shielded her eyes against the grit. The side door of the helicopter slid open before the wheels even touched the asphalt. Inside the hospital, the ER staff had rushed to the windows. Sterling, Brenda, and the residents were pressing their faces against the glass, watching in confusion. "What is that?" Brenda asked, her voice high with panic. "Is it a crash?" "No," Sterling said, frowning. "That's the Navy." Two figures jumped out of the helicopter. They were dressed in full tactical gear, multicam uniforms, drop-leg holsters, communication headsets. Not doctors, soldiers. They sprinted toward the ER entrance, ignoring the security guard who was cowering behind a pillar. Audrey stood her ground. She recognized the walk. She recognized the urgency. The lead soldier, a towering man with a thick beard and the rank of Master Sergeant visible on his chest patch, saw her standing under the awning. He skidded to a halt 10 feet away. He looked at her wet scrubs. He looked at her tired face. "Audrey!" the soldier roared over the sound of the rotors. "Audrey Hart!" Audrey straightened up, her posture shifting instantly from the fired nurse to something entirely different. "Sergeant Miller." The soldier ran up to her, breathless. "Thank God we found you. We tracked your phone." The hospital doors slid open behind Audrey. Sterling and Brenda came running out, followed by security. "Hey!" Sterling shouted, trying to regain authority over the chaotic scene. "You can't land that thing here. This is private property. I'm calling the police." The Master Sergeant didn't even look at Sterling. He kept his eyes locked on Audrey. "We need you," the sergeant said, his voice desperate. "It's the colonel. He's been hit. Bad. Private sector doctors can't stabilize him. He's asking for the ghost. He's asking for you." Sterling froze. "The ghost?" Audrey looked at the sergeant, then back at the helicopter. "I'm not active duty anymore, Miller. I'm a civilian. I just got fired." The sergeant stepped closer. "Audrey, it's Reaper. It's Sullivan. He took 3 rounds in a training op gone wrong. He's got maybe an hour. He won't let anyone else touch him. He said, 'Get me heart, or let me bleed out.'" Audrey's heart stopped. Sullivan. The man who had carried her out of a burning convoy in Aleppo. The man she owed everything to. She looked back at Sterling. The doctor looked small now, insignificant. "I need a flight suit," Audrey said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "On the bird," Miller said. "Let's go." Audrey took a step, then stopped. She turned slowly to face Dr. Sterling. The rain dripped from his nose. He looked terrified of the soldiers of the helicopter, and suddenly of her. "Dr. Sterling," Audrey said, her voice clear. "You were right about one thing." What?" Sterling stammered. "I don't belong in your hospital." She turned and sprinted toward the helicopter. The interior of the MH-60 Seahawk was a deafening, vibrating world of steel and shadow, a world Audrey Hart had not inhabited for 5 years. as the helicopter banked sharply, leaving the city lights of the hospital far below. The transition within her was almost physical. The slouch she had adopted to appear non-threatening to the hospital administration vanished. Her spine straightened. Her eyes, usually cast down to avoid confrontation with Brenda or Dr. Sterling, now scanned the cabin with predatory alertness. Sergeant Miller handed her a headset. She slid it over her ears, the roar of the rotors dampening to a dull hum, replaced by the crackle of the comms loop. "Sitrep Miller," Audrey said. Her voice over the intercom was unrecognizable from the soft-spoken nurse who had just been fired. It was hard, commanding, and stripped of all pleasantries. Colonel Sullivan was leading a training exercise with a partner unit from the SAS near the coastline. Miller explained, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "Live fire drill. Something went wrong. A ricochet or a misfire, we don't know yet. But a 5.56 round entered the lower abdominal quadrant, clipped the hip bone, and fragmented. He's got shrapnel near the spine and significant internal hemorrhaging." Audrey closed her eyes for a brief second, visualizing the anatomy. "Who is working on him?" "We have a field medic, Corporal Jenkins. He's good, but he's 22 and he's shaking." Sullivan refused medevac to the VA. He said. Miller paused, looking at Audrey with a mixture of reverence and fear. He said, "Find the ghost. If I'm going to die, I want her to be the one to tell me it's time. He's not going to die." Audrey said the statement, not a hope, but an order. Miller pointed to a duffel bag secured by cargo netting near her feet. "We grabbed your old kit from the storage unit you authorized us to keep, and a flight suit. Can you change?" Audrey didn't hesitate. Modesty was a luxury for civilians. In the dim red tactical light of the cabin, she stripped off the stained baggy blue scrubs that represented her months of humiliation at St. Jude's. She kicked them into the corner like a shed skin. She pulled on the olive-drab flight suit, zipping it up to her neck. She laced up the tactical boots. When she turned back to Miller, Audrey Hart, the nurse, was gone. Sitting in her place was Lieutenant Commander Rhett. Audrey Hart, call sign, Ghost, the legendary trauma specialist, who had rewritten the field manuals on damage control resuscitation during the darkest days of the Desert Wars. "ETA?" she asked. 6 minutes. We're taking him to the Naval Air Station. They have a sterile trauma bay in Hangar 4, but the local surgeons are standing down. Sullivan threatened to shoot anyone who touched him before you got there. Audrey let out a short, dry laugh. That sounds like him. Stubborn old mule. She opened the medical kit Miller had brought. Her hands, which Dr. Sterling had mocked for being shaky, moved with fluid, terrifying precision. She checked the laryngoscope, the scalpel blades, the hemostatic agents. Everything was exactly where she had left it 5 years ago. "How bad is the blood loss?" she asked. "Class 3 shock. BP is 80/50. Heart rate 130. He's conscious, but barely." "Get on the horn to the ground crew," Audrey commanded. "I want 4 units of O-negative warmed and ready. I want a cell saver set up, and tell them to clear the room of anyone who doesn't have a star on their shoulder or a scalpel in their hand. I don't want an audience." "Copy that, Ghost," Miller said, a grin breaking through his beard. "God, it's good to have you back." Audrey looked out the porthole. The rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the lights of the approaching airfield. Below, she could see the flashing lights of a convoy waiting on the tarmac. For months, she had been the maid in scrubs. She had let Dr. Sterling berate her. She had let Brenda assign her the worst tasks. She had done it because she thought she wanted peace. She thought she wanted to leave the blood and the noise behind. But as the helicopter began its aggressive combat landing, flaring hard and dropping fast, Audrey realized the truth. She didn't want peace. She wanted to be useful. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the electric hum of purpose in her veins. The wheels slammed onto the concrete. The side door flew open. "Go, go, go!" Miller shouted. Audrey leaped out into the rain, sprinting toward the waiting ambulance that would take them to Hangar 4. She didn't look back at the city. She didn't think about St. Jude's, that life was over. The mission had begun. The trauma bay inside Hangar 4 was a stark contrast to the gleaming white-tiled ER at St. Jude's. It was industrial smelling of jet fuel and antiseptic. The lighting was harsh halogen suspended from steel beams. In the center of the room, surrounded by nervous-looking military medics and a terrified civilian doctor who had been brought in from the base clinic, lay Colonel James Reaper Sullivan. He was a large man, a mountain of muscle and scars, now pale and sweating profusely. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Audrey burst through the double doors, Miller right behind her. The room went silent. The civilian doctor, a man named Dr. Aris, stepped forward. "Who are you?" "We need a vascular surgeon, not another." "Step away from the patient," Audrey said. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. She walked straight to the gurney. Sullivan's eyes were half closed, but when he saw her, a weak smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Took you long enough," he wheezed. "Traffic. Bad." "I had to take out the trash first," Audrey said, grabbing his wrist to check his radial pulse. It was thready, barely there. "You look like hell, Jim." "Feel like it," he grunted. Audrey turned to the room. "I need an ultrasound fast exam now. Jenkins, get that blood hung. Pressure bag, squeeze it in. Aris, you're on airway. If he stops breathing, you tube him. Do not mess it up." Dr. Aris bristled. "Now listen here. I am the ranking medical officer on this base. And I am the person keeping him alive," Audrey snapped, not even looking at him as she cut away Sullivan's uniform with trauma shears. "If you want to compare ranks, we can do that later. Right now, if you don't secure his airway, I will have Sergeant Miller remove you from this room. Physically." Miller took a step toward the doctor, his hand resting on his sidearm. Dr. Aris swallowed hard and moved to the head of the bed, grabbing the ambu bag. Audrey focused on the wound. It was ugly. The entry wound was just above the right iliac crest. The exit wound. There was no exit wound. "The bullet is still inside," Audrey murmured. "Miller, probe." She grabbed the ultrasound wand and pressed it against Sullivan's abdomen. The screen flickered to life. Dark fluid filled the abdominal cavity. "He's bleeding out internally," she announced. "The fragment nicked the common iliac artery. We don't have time for a scan. We have to open him up. Here, now." "Here," Dr. Aris squeaked. "This isn't a sterile operating theater. The infection risk. The infection won't kill him because he'll be dead in 3 minutes from exsanguination," Audrey yelled. "Scalpel." A young medic slapped the scalpel into her hand. "Jim." Audrey leaned close to Sullivan's ear. "I'm going to have to put you under. Ketamine and propofol. You're going to wake up sore, but you're going to wake up. Do you trust me?" Sullivan looked at her, his eyes clearing for a moment. "With my life ghost. Always." "Push the drugs," Audrey ordered. As Sullivan's eyes drifted shut, Audrey took a deep breath. She blocked out the noise of the rain on the hangar roof. She blocked out the smell of fuel. She visualized the anatomy beneath the skin. She made the incision. A midline laparotomy extending from the xiphoid to the pubis. Blood welled up immediately, dark and angry. "Suction," she commanded. "More laps. Pack it. Pack it." Her hands moved in a blur. She reached into the abdominal cavity, her fingers working blindly through the pool of blood to find the source. She felt the tear in the artery. It was jagged, pulsing weakly. "I've got the bleeder," she said, her voice calm. "Vascular clamp." She clamped the artery. The immediate flow of blood stopped. The monitors, which had been screaming a low-tone warning, began to settle. "Pressure is stabilizing," Jenkins called out. 90/60. "Okay." Audrey exhaled. "Now the hard part. I need to suture this. The fragment is wedged against the lumbar vertebrae. If I move it wrong, I paralyze him." For the next hour, the hangar was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and Audrey's quiet commands. "Forceps, 50 proline, retractor." She worked with a delicacy that defied the brutality of the environment. She dissected the tissue around the artery, removed the jagged metal fragment that was pressing dangerously against the nerve root, and sutured the vessel wall. It was a surgery that would have been difficult in a Mayo Clinic operating room with a full team. Audrey was doing it in a hangar with a field kit. "Suture complete," she whispered, releasing the clamp now. She released the metal clamp. She watched. No blood leaked. The pulse in the artery was strong and rhythmic. "Flow is restored," she said. "He's pinking up." A collective sigh went through the room. Sergeant Miller slumped against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. Even Dr. Aris looked at her with wide, stunned eyes. "That was," Aris stammered. "I've never seen a repair like that. The speed, the technique." Audrey didn't answer. She began closing the abdomen, her stitching neat and efficient. "Get him ready for transport to Walter Reed once he's stable," she said, finally stepping back and stripping off her bloody gloves. "But he's out of the woods." She walked over to a metal sink in the corner and began scrubbing her hands and arms, the water turning red. She looked at herself in the polished metal reflection. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with sweat, and a smear of Sullivan's blood on her cheek. She felt exhausted, but she also felt alive. "Ma'am." She turned. It was Sergeant Miller. He was holding a satellite phone. "It's General Holloway, from the Pentagon. He wants a status report. And he wants to know why the hell you were working as a janitor in a civilian hospital." Audrey dried her hands on a paper towel. A cold, hard look entered her eyes. "Give me the phone," she said. "And Miller. Yes, Ghost. Get the helicopter ready again. Once I talk to the general, I have some unfinished business to attend to." "Back at St. Jude's?" Miller asked, a knowing look on his face. "Back at St. Jude's," Audrey confirmed. "Dr. Sterling fired a nurse tonight. I think it's time he met the commander." St. Jude's Hospital was in a state of meltdown. It had been 2 hours since the black helicopter had lifted off, taking the incompetent nurse and the mysterious soldiers with it. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere inside the ER was electric, with confusion and fear. Dr. Sterling was pacing the nurse's station, trying to project an air of authority, but his hands were shaking. He had been fielding calls from the hospital director, the local police, and the FA for the last 90 minutes. "I'm telling you, I don't know who they were," Sterling shouted into the phone, his face red. "They trespassed, they destroyed 3 cars in the parking lot, and they kidnapped a staff member." He slammed the receiver down. Brenda was sitting at the desk, scrolling through her phone. Her face pale. "Dr. Sterling," she whispered, "you need to see this." "Not now." "Brenda, I have to figure out how to explain this to the board." Greg, look. She shoved the phone in his face. It was a TikTok video. It had been filmed by a teenager in the waiting room through the glass doors. The caption read, "WTF, Navy SEALs raid hospital to save nurse." The video was shaky, but the image was clear. It showed the helicopter landing the massive soldier jumping out and the interaction with Audrey. It showed Sterling shouting, looking small and impotent, next to the giant Master Sergeant. But the most damning part was the audio. The teenager had been close enough to the door to catch the sergeant's shout. "It's Reaper. He's asking for the ghost. He's asking for you." The video already had 2.4 million views. "Read the comments?" Brenda said, her voice trembling. Sterling squinted at the scrolling text. User 77. OFG. Is that Audrey Hart? My dad served with her in Kabul. She's not a nurse. She's a legend. User Marine/01. The ghost. That's the angel of the Koran Gol. She saved my whole platoon in 2018. Who is the idiot doctor yelling at her vet life? That doctor is Dr. Gregory Sterling at St. Jude's. He's toast. You don't disrespect a Navy Cross recipient. Navy Cross, Sterling whispered, the blood draining from his face. That's impossible. She's a temp. She dropped a tray of instruments this morning. She was faking it, Brenda said, realizing the horror of her own complicity. She was laying low, and we treated her like dirt. Suddenly, the automatic doors of the ER slid open. But it wasn't a patient. 4 men in dark suits walked in. They moved with a synchronized shark-like efficiency. Following them was a man in a crisp navy dress uniform, 2 stars gleaming on his shoulders. Rear Admiral Halloway. The ER went dead silent. Even the patients stopped moaning. The Admiral scanned the room, his gaze landing on Dr. Sterling like a laser designator. He walked over his footsteps, echoing on the linoleum. "Dr. Gregory Sterling?" the Admiral asked. His voice was polite, but it carried an undertone of immense danger. Yes, I am the Chief of Surgery," Sterling stammered, straightening his white coat. "If this is about the helicopter, I have already filed a complaint with the police. It was a reckless endangerment of my facility, and I'm not here about the helicopter," Halloway interrupted calmly. "The United States Navy will reimburse the damages to your parking lot." He stepped closer, invading Sterling's personal space. "I am here about Lieutenant Commander Audrey Hart." Sterling swallowed. She was fired for incompetence. She performed an unauthorized procedure. Incompetence. Halloway repeated the word as if tasting something rotten. He turned to one of the suits. "Agent Vance, play the tape." One of the men in suits held up a tablet. It showed the security footage from Bay 1, captured just hours ago. It showed the resident freezing. It showed the patient dying. And then it showed Audrey moving in, fast, efficient, perfect, and inserting the needle that saved the man's life. "We reviewed the footage," Halloway said. "That was a textbook needle thoracostomy, performed in under 3 seconds. The patient, Mr. John Doe, is currently stable in your ICU, thanks to her. If she hadn't acted, he would be dead. Is that your definition of incompetence, Doctor?" "She didn't have privileges," Sterling argued, weakly. "It's a liability." "The woman you fired," Halloway continued, ignoring the excuse, "is one of the most decorated combat trauma specialists in the history of the Naval Medical Corps. She served 4 tours with Joint Special Operations. She holds the Navy Cross for valor. She retired to take care of her sick mother and wanted a quiet life. She wanted to serve your community." Halloway leaned in his face, inches from Sterling's. "And instead of utilizing her skills to save lives, You had her mopping floors and humiliated her because her quiet competence threatened your fragile ego. Now see here, Sterling tried to bluster. You can't talk to me like that. I run this ER. Not anymore, a new voice said. Sterling spun around. Standing behind the Admiral was Dr. Pinter, the hospital director. He looked furious. Director Pinter, Sterling said, relieved. Tell these men to leave. Pack your things, Gregory, Pinter said coldly. I saw the video. I saw the comments. The donor phones have been ringing off the hook for the last hour, threatening to pull funding if the doctor who fired the war hero isn't removed. You're suspended pending an investigation by the medical board. Sterling looked around. The residents were staring at him. Brenda was looking at her shoes. The security guard was smirking. You can't do this, Sterling whispered. It's done, Pinter said. Admiral. Pinter turned to the military man. Is she coming back? We would be honored to reinstate her, with a promotion, head nurse, anything she wants. Halloway checked his watch. She is currently en route back here, not to work. She left something behind, and she wants to visit a patient. A patient? Pinter asked. A Mr. Silas Vance, Halloway said, reading from a file. A homeless veteran she was tending to when she was fired. She wants to ensure his care plan is followed. Sterling felt a wave of nausea. The homeless man. The man he had told her to ignore. She's coming back, Brenda squeaked. Oh, yes. Halloway smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And she's bringing the colonel with her. He insisted on meeting the man who called his savior a maid. At that moment, the sound returned, the deep, thrumming beat of rotors. The glass doors rattled. She was back. And this time she wasn't coming in through the service entrance. The return of the MH-60 Seahawk was different this time. When it had first landed, it was an invasion, a shock to the system of a quiet, rain-slicked hospital parking lot. Now, as the rotors beat the air into submission, the sound felt like a judgment. Inside the emergency room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Dr. Gregory Sterling stood near the nurse's station, his face a mask of crumbling arrogance. He had been stripped of his badge by Director Pinter, but he hadn't left yet. He couldn't. His ego wouldn't allow him to flee like a criminal. He needed to have the last word. He needed to prove that he was the victim of a military overreaction. The automatic doors slid open, but nobody walked through immediately. First came two Marines in dress blues, stepping in with precise, synchronized movements to hold the doors. Then a wheelchair was guided through. In it sat Colonel James Sullivan. He was pale, an IV line running into his arm, and a fresh bandage visible beneath his unbuttoned uniform jacket. But his eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the intensity of a weapon system acquiring a target. Pushing the wheelchair was Audrey Hart. She was still wearing the olive-drab flight suit, now stained with the colonel's blood and the grease of the hangar. She walked with her head high, her posture relaxed but ready. She didn't look like the maid in Scrubs anymore. She looked like a warrior returning to the battlefield to collect her dead. Behind them trailed Rear Admiral Halloway and the entourage of suits. The silence in the ER was absolute. The phones had stopped ringing. The residents who usually scurried about with self-important haste were pressed against the walls, trying to make themselves invisible. Audrey didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at Brenda, who was trembling behind the reception desk. She walked straight past them, pushing the colonel toward bed 4. Is he still here? Audrey asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Yes, ma'am, a terrified young nurse squeaked. We didn't move him. Audrey parked the colonel's wheelchair next to the bed, where the homeless man, Silas, lay sleeping. She gently checked Silas's monitor. His heart rate was steady. The saline drip she had adjusted hours ago before her life had been upended was doing its job. "Audrey." Silas stirred, opening his crusted eyes. He squinted at her flight suit. "You look different. Did you join the circus?" Audrey smiled, a genuine, warm expression that none of the hospital staff had ever seen. "Something like that, Silas. I brought a friend. He wanted to meet the man who kept me company." Colonel Sullivan leaned forward in his chair, wincing slightly from the pain in his abdomen. He extended a hand that had signed orders, sending thousands of men into combat toward the homeless man. "Mr. Silas," Sullivan rumbled, "Audrey tells me you were a corporal in the 1st Infantry. Vietnam, 68. Silas's eyes widened. He sat up straighter, ignoring his nausea. The fog of alcohol and sickness seemed to clear instantly. He looked at Sullivan's rank, then at his own trembling hand. He wiped it on the sheet before shaking the colonel's hand. "Yes, sir. Que san. But I ain't been called corporal in a long time. Just a drunk now." "A Marine is never just anything," Sullivan said firmly. "And you treated my corpsman with respect when the people in this building treated her like garbage. For that you have my thanks, and the thanks of the United States Navy." Sterling couldn't take it anymore. The absurdity of the scene, a colonel thanking a homeless drunk while ignoring the chief of surgery, snapped the last thread of his patience. "This is ridiculous," Sterling shouted, stepping forward. Director Pinter tried to grab his arm, but Sterling shook him off. "This is a hospital, not a VFW hall. I don't care who you are or what medal she has. She endangered a patient in my trauma bay. She violated protocol." Audrey turned slowly. She left Silas's bedside and walked toward Sterling. The room seemed to shrink. "Protocol," Audrey repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "Yes, protocol." Sterling spat his face, flushing. "You think because some helicopter picked you up that you're above the rules. You are a nurse. You are subordinate to the attending physician. That is the hierarchy you humiliated me in front of my staff." "I saved a man's life," Audrey said. "Mr. Doe in the ICU. He's alive. If I had followed your protocol, if I had waited for your resident to stop shaking, he would be dead. Is your ego worth more than his life, doctor? I would have saved him." Sterling lied, his voice rising to a shriek. "I am the best surgeon in this state, and you're a washed-up field medic who thinks patching up grunts in the dirt makes you a doctor. You have no place here." Audrey stopped 3 feet from him. She looked him up and down, her gaze clinical dissecting. "You're right, Gregory," she said, using his first name for the first time. It hit him like a slap. "I don't have a place here, because this place is broken. You treat the staff like servants. You treat patients like numbers. You treat the poor like trash." She gestured to the colonel, then to the admiral. "Admiral Holloway has just informed me that the Navy is looking to establish a new civilian-military partnership for trauma training, a specialized center for complex polytrauma. They need a director." Sterling scoffed. "And let me guess, they're going to give it to you. You're a nurse." "Actually," Admiral Holloway interjected, his voice smooth and cold, "the position requires a medical degree, which is why we were so surprised when we pulled Lieutenant Commander Hart's file. She didn't just retire as a trauma nurse, Dr. Sterling." Holloway pulled a document from a folder and held it up. "After her 3rd tour, the Navy paid for her medical schooling. She graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins. She is a double-board certified trauma surgeon. She chose to work as a nurse here because she wanted to be at the bedside. She wanted to care for patients, not play God. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Audrey. He looked at the document. "You're a doctor," Brenda whispered from the desk, her face horrified. "I am," Audrey said softly. "But I'm a nurse first, and I'm proud of that. It's a shame you aren't." Audrey turned back to Sterling. "The Navy is pulling its funding from St. Jude's Gregory. The specialized trauma center is being relocated to the university hospital across town, and I'm going to be running it." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Sterling could hear. "And I'm going to hire every single nurse you've bullied. I'm going to hire the residents you've screamed at. And I'm going to leave you here in your empty kingdom with no one to blame but yourself." Sterling staggered back, hitting the wall. He looked around for support, but he found none. His residents were looking at Audrey with awe. Pinter, the hospital director, was already on his phone, likely doing damage control to save his own career. "Get him out of here!" Pinter snapped at the security guards, pointing at Sterling. "You can't do this!" Sterling screamed as the guards took his arms. "I am St. Jude's. I am this hospital." "Not anymore," Audrey said. She didn't watch him get dragged out. She turned back to Silas. "Mr. Silas," she said gently, "how would you like a private room and a hot meal? The VA has a bed waiting for you at the new center." Silas wept. He covered his face with his rough hands and sobbed. "Thank you, Ghost." Audrey patted his shoulder. Then she looked at the colonel. "Let's go home, Jim." The fallout was swift and brutal, exactly the kind of karma the internet loved. Within 48 hours, the story of the nurse who was a secret surgeon had gone global. The TikTok video was just the spark. The full release of the security footage by the Navy, redacted to protect patient privacy, but clearly showing Audrey's heroism and Sterling's incompetence, fueled a firestorm. Dr. Gregory Sterling didn't just lose his job. The medical board launched an immediate inquiry into his practice. Dozens of former staff members came forward with stories of abuse, negligence, and toxic behavior. He was sued by the family of a patient he had lost due to surgical error 3 years prior, a case that was reopened thanks to the new testimony regarding his stability. He lost his license, his reputation, and his expensive condo. The last anyone heard, he was working as a consultant for an insurance firm in a different state, reviewing paperwork in a windowless cubicle. St. Jude's Hospital went through a massive restructuring. Director Pinter was forced into early retirement. The culture of the ER changed overnight, but it was too late to save their trauma rating. The funding had already moved. 3 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Hart-Sullivan Center for Trauma Medicine was held at the University Hospital. It was a beautiful spring day. The facility was state-of-the-art, designed with input from combat medics and veteran nurses. It prioritized efficiency, teamwork, and above all, respect for every member of the staff. Audrey stood at the podium. She wasn't wearing scrubs nor a flight suit. She wore a simple white coat. Underneath her name, the embroidery read, Audrey Hart, MD-RN, Director of Trauma Surgery. She looked out at the crowd. In the front row sat Colonel Sullivan, now fully recovered and back on active duty, though he had flown in just for this. Next to him sat Sergeant Miller, looking uncomfortable in a dress uniform. And next to Miller sat a man who was almost unrecognizable. Clean-shaven, wearing a decent suit and holding a cane. Silas. He was working as the center's new patient liaison, helping veterans navigate the healthcare system. He looked 10 years younger. Audrey adjusted the microphone. She hated speeches. She preferred action. But she knew this needed to be said. "They called me just a nurse," Audrey began. Her voice amplified across the courtyard, as if that was an insult, as if caring for the sick, cleaning the wounds, and holding the hands of the dying is lesser work. She paused, looking at the rows of nurses she had hired away from St. Jude's. Brenda wasn't among them. She had quit nursing entirely, but many of the young residents and nurses who had suffered under Sterling were there beaming. "In the field," Audrey continued, "rank doesn't stop a bleed. Ego doesn't restart a heart. The only thing that matters is the person next to you. The only thing that matters is the mission. We are building this center on one principle: no one is invisible. From the surgeon to the janitor, we are one team." The applause was polite at first, then raucous. Sullivan let out a "oorah" that startled the mayor. After the ceremony, Audrey walked through the new ER. It was humming with activity. A helicopter was landing on the roof, a medevac bringing in a critical case. "Dr. Hart!" a young resident called out, running up to her. "Trauma 1, multi-system injury. We need you." Audrey felt that familiar shift, the narrowing of focus, the calm in the storm. "I'm on my way," she said. She walked toward the trauma bay. As she passed a supply closet, she saw a new hire, a young man looking overwhelmed, struggling with a mop bucket that had a stuck wheel. He looked terrified that someone would yell at him. Audrey stopped. The resident was waiting, but this would only take a second. She walked over to the young man. He flinched as she approached. "It sticks on the left side," Audrey said gently. She kicked the wheel expertly, and it snapped into place. "There. Use your hips to turn it, not your back. Save your energy." The young man looked up at her, shocked. He saw the director badge. "Thank you, doctor," he stammered. Audrey smiled. She thought of Sterling. She thought of the rain. She thought of the long road back to herself. "You're welcome," she said. "And if anyone gives you trouble, you tell them to come see me." She turned and walked into the trauma bay, the doors hissing shut behind her. She was exactly where she belonged. The story of Audrey Hart is a powerful reminder that true strength often walks in silence. While Dr. Sterling sought validation through noise and titles, Audrey commanded respect through action and humanity. It serves as a lesson to never underestimate the people around us, for the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding the world together. In the end, karma didn't just punish the arrogant. It elevated the humble, proving that while titles can be given, legacy is earned. If you enjoyed this story of justice and heroism, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe for more powerful stories of military heroes and real-life karma. Comment Team Audrey below if you think nurses are the real heroes. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.